and we're here again with conversations with microphones. We chose microphones instead of banana phones because of their vastly superior impedance values. I don't know if you guys ever tried to hook up a multimeter to a banana phone. It's not good.
No.
I'm Kelsey, and I'm here again today with Ryan.
Hello.
And Nathan.
Hey, how's it going?
And we're going to talk a little bit about today black or white. We kind of touched on this a little bit last time, sometimes known as a false dichotomy or false dilemma, especially if you're talking about the both sides. We're going to take a little bit of a peek on that and kind of launch in. But this show, we are basically trying to model good conversations, talk about some strategies and tactics while also discussing some interesting and challenging conversational topics. So I'll kick it off there. And I think, Nathan, you wanted to say some things that you were thinking about as well.
Oh, were we going to discuss the spotlight effect? Is that the idea?
Well, I know that before we got started
right, yeah.
here, it drew the card on basically the bias here.
That's right, yeah.
As the spotlight effect. And actually, we were joking about it as kind of the teenager effect.
Yeah, for
because
sure.
You overestimate how much people notice how you look and act. And it can be something that anybody can really kind of jump into. But I think that a lot of people can kind of relate to this being something that comes in more as you mature a little bit. And sometimes you step back into it. Instead of worrying about how you're being judged, consider how you're making others feel. Mm-hmm. They'll notice this much more, and you'll also be making the world a better place.
Awesome.
I
Nice.
think that this is something that happens a lot. I mean, when you're preparing yourself for work or maybe a presentation, you might be thinking, how much are people really judging my intelligence or how I look or how I'm talking? And really instead kind of focus on the value behind your words or perhaps even your own position and really just kind of what you are in the world just as yourself as opposed to what other people are seeing and hearing.
Yeah. And I think, we should probably read the other one that we came up here with too. If you want to go ahead and...
Sure, yeah. So we pulled up a logical fallacy here as well. The previous was a bias. And this one, the fallacy is black or white. And as Kelsey alluded to, it is also known as a false dilemma. In this instance, you are presented with two alternative states as the only possibilities, when in fact more possibilities exist. So this insidious tactic has the appearance of forming a logical argument. But under closer scrutiny, it becomes evident that there are more possibilities than the either-or choice that is presented. Binary, black or white thinking doesn't allow for the many different variables, conditions, and contexts in which there would exist more than just the two possibilities put forth. It frames the argument misleadingly and obscures rational, honest debate. For example, whilst rallying support for his plan to fundamentally undermine citizens' rights, the Supreme Leader told the people they were either on his side or they were on the side of the enemy. And I think that this is kind of one of those either or, this side, that side, two sides to a thing. It can be difficult sometimes to get away from that, especially in our environment here in the States where you have a two-party system. But I think it is very important to recognize that just because you have a two-party system or possibly those kinds of things doesn't mean that any particular position boils down to two positions only.
Yeah. I think that's where we were going to talk a little bit about the social dilemma. With some of that, just kind of interesting with that being something that came out not too long ago.
The show on Netflix?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. We were talking about the idea that they were kind of talking about how in some ways social media has polarized us a lot more. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we were laughing about was the whole extreme center.
Extreme center.
Yeah, exactly.
I thought that was pretty delightful.
It was. Yeah. And I mean, that would be like, a really great, I think a really great name for a new political party as well.
Possibly.
I'm like, we could have a whole, I was thinking about this the other day. I'm like, we could have a whole party platform on centrism,
Almost,
it's like, trying to figure out positions from sort of, a couple of different groups and saying like, what is, sort of the, negotiation here. Maybe it should also be called the negotiation party. We can have a whole
for
party
sure.
around that, you know?
It kind of reminds me of how South Park was joking about agnosticism. And they were like, it was a house of like extreme agnostics or militant agnostics. And they could only drink Dr. Pepper in the house because the flavor was ambiguous, you know?
Interesting.
Yeah, it was really funny. So,
drink Dr.
you know, because it had the same kind of like seeming contradiction of like, most centrists are not exactly radicalized, you know, which I think is why it's delightfully funny.
Extreme centers.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, in that particular show, the Social Dilemma, one of the things that I actually took away from it had a lot to do with how these some of these things that have happened as a result of kind of this unintentional radicalization, and that was kind of their point of the extreme center, was this radicalization of a person through social media. It was interesting, the point that was made about how some of it was very unintentional because of AI that was put in place. Really that was put in place to put forward or put in front of somebody something that would essentially keep their eye contact on a screen and to keep somebody interested in clicking onto the next thing. And because it really wasn't looking at it from an actual, is this good for this person perspective, it was just throwing in what is this person looking at and hovering over. And that's kind of the interesting part to me about that, is it really did kind of highlight some of the issues that come into effect whenever you put in some machines or machinations behind infrastructure. Sometimes you don't know what the actual effects are going to be until after something starts happening.
I think that's a great point, Ryan. And I think a lot of that documentary for me was about discussing the unintended consequences of using some of this technology and maximizing the gaze time. You know, that there is a tendency where the more that you are searching for something to pull people into more extreme videos and have that search kind of devolve, or, you know, you have a bunch of people sitting around and instead of having conversations with each other, it just all of a sudden they start all pulling out their phones when there's a lull in the conversation. So I think one of the things that we are trying to do with this show is look at where our conversation is today and how it may have devolved or changed in some unintended ways, and what we can do to restore the quality of those conversations so that we are really examining and kind of taking, again, going back to that word epistemology, like how do we know what we know, or that close reflection of where we're at with things, and re-examine where we are with conversation and how to improve it.
There's an interesting thing with, you know, what the Social Dilemma was pointing out is because what they were saying is basically that because social media is, you know, it's a business. So they're focused on making money. And a lot of these things that we see, because they're focused on making money, they are trying to enhance engagement as much as possible. And I don't know that they specifically are trying to make people extreme. I actually think it's just more of a natural byproduct. And I think that would just be how I would maybe tweak a little bit of what you said, because it seems like that's just an unfortunate thing that nobody really maybe intended to happen. It's just like the things that are the most extreme, the most egregious, the things that we're like, oh my God, I can't believe that, I must click on it. Like it's the whole train wreck effect, right? You know, people, it's like might have in one sense like, oh, I don't want to watch that thing, yet I can't look away.
Right. I think that actually, I mean, to
great.
your point too, like it kind of comes down to, I think even at the end of that movie that, they talk about intentionality. So instead of just kind of having media or any information just kind of wash over you like a waterfall of just like, oh, I'm just going along for the ride. Like, here's the thing. Well, that's interesting. I'm just going to click that one and click that one, click that one. Maybe instead, go to your search engine and look at the one thing that you're actually looking for, and then just focus on that one thing.
Exactly.
Get the answer that you wanted, and then turn it off.
Yep.
There's nothing wrong with that.
Exactly.
Intentionality is very important.
Yeah, they had like a couple recommendations, I think, towards the middle and end of the documentary, like don't have phones at the table.
Yeah.
Or if you're on a certain video search site, don't always click the recommended video automatically. Actually be intentional about what you're searching for. And so I think that intentionality is a good point. And then we can apply that intentionality with some rules of thumb in conversation as well.
Yes, and I think that is exactly where I was going to go. I think it's a perfect kickoff to get into the next point here. We have some things that we've been developing for a little bit here. We call them conversation guidelines, and kind of displaying that on the screen now so we can kind of talk about some of these that we've come up with. So conversation guidelines, we kind of split it up into a couple of different sections. And so the first section here is watch your reactions, talking a little bit more about, sort of avoiding some reactionary measures, and then get into kind of the proactive things that we can do to engage in conversation. We'll kind of go from there. So watch your reactions. I'll just start with the first one because I thought this was the most important, was do not make ad hominem attacks, so no name calling. We say this dovetails with proactive rule number 1, which we'll get to. Yet the ad hominem attacks is so pervasive in so many different conversations, especially social media or online. You see this a lot where it just becomes a flame war where, and I kind of mentioned this, I think, in our first episode too, where just saying this is something I really try to personally avoid. It's like, hey, you're just an idiot and so forth. So I say it deserves to stand apart as its own rule. Letting an argument devolve into name calling is the surest sign that the parties have given up trying to rationalize their positions and have resorted to attacking the person directly. And, like I said, you see it all the time where it's like, you're an idiot, you're stupid. Well, I mean, that doesn't do anything to further the conversation. At that point, it's it's almost meaningless.
I mean, it's not necessarily just like the kind of the generic "you're an idiot" or whatever. It can also be like some of the name calling associated with somebody's position as well. Like, oh, you're just a person that believes this.
Oh, sure.
Like that, and therefore, what's the point of listening to you almost? And it just. I think that actually is the one that I see them. Exactly. That seems to be the one that comes up a lot, especially in comment sections.
Exactly. I know what you mean. And I think that we see a lot of those different kind of colorations, and it really just serves to continue to put people into boxes. And it's almost sort of a straw man too, because you're trying to put somebody into a certain bucket or box to make it easier for you to disregard them or their arguments by just saying that's the case, when in a lot of cases, if you would say, well, do you believe in this particular ideology, that person would probably be like, no, that's not what I'm saying at all.
Right.
Yeah. So I think it's important to define ad hominem. It means to the person in Latin.
Yes, thank you.
and it means, so it's when you're either attacking a person's character or their motivations, and name calling, of course, is a part of that as well. And I think one of the reasons, based on the research that I've seen, that makes this so toxic and dangerous in conversations and really shuts things down is it threatens the person's identity. And one of the books that I read, it's called Difficult Conversations with...
You want to say psychologically dangerous, right?
Yeah, psychologically dangerous, yes. Right. Yeah, their psychological safety. Yeah. Because like trust and psychological safety is a necessary prerequisite to having a high quality and mutually beneficial conversation. So if I'm threatening another person's identity, that's going to shut things down really fast. So that's Difficult Conversations with Stone, Patton, and Heen, and they talk about grounding your identity in the conversation. So I think that's really important because if you are calling another person names, it's signaling pretty quickly that you are no longer having a good faith argument or a good faith conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. Whenever you start to equivocate, I mean, again, like kind of touching on what you were saying before, you really are kind of putting something or someone, in this particular case, into a box. You've essentially labeled them. And I think that labeling, that name calling, that kind of personal statement is really what we're trying to avoid.
Absolutely. Do you want to go on to number 2?
Sure. So again, watching our reactions, we're kind of sticking with the reactions here. In the context of the conversation, delay value judgments. And when we say that, we're saying, instead, what you're really wanting to try to do is to collect information. You want to, as you're listening to someone, ask genuine questions. Questions of interest, essentially, without always trying to figure out whether or not it is right or wrong, or whether you agree or disagree. Essentially, you're kind of, instead of initially thinking about whether or not you have you agree with that stance or otherwise, you're kind of
Cats in the episode.
felines attack.
Yes.
And I definitely agree with that statement. But no, I'll just kind of continue reading here.
Yeah.
There will be plenty of time for you to make up your mind about what is said later. And really what we're touching on here is that just listen. You can have a conversation without having to decide whether or not you agree with somebody or not, or whether or not you think that the point is the right or wrong thing. Just listen to what's actually being said. And I think that kind of goes into some of the proactive engagement that we look into later as well.
We'll get to that later.
But the value judgment is kind of something that's actually in the back of your head as you're listening to something.
And I think it's really interesting that we started out, kind of continuing from last conversation about, black or white, false dichotomy, false dilemma. And then, in the context of this one, we get into even right or wrong or agree or disagree. Even those could be sort of a black or white, false dilemma. And it's like, that's even a way for me to, challenge myself when we say like something just true or false. There can be a lot of shades to something, and we can determine, hey, if something is true or false or right or wrong, but still acknowledge that there could be a lot of nuance into those value judgments as well. And so it really makes sense to me to, as we say, delay that judgment a little bit and then really try to come up with a good nuanced judgment about that later. Give yourself some time to evaluate all of those facets.
I think that's a really good point. And I like that you said delay value judgments. There's even a Zen proverb, or a Zen koan is what they're often called, that says, if you have a full cup of tea, you can't pour any more tea into it. It'll overflow. So you have to come into the conversation, at least in some sense, empty. You have a sea of opinions, and your mind is full of all kinds of opinions of, is this good? Is this bad? Can I trust this person or not? And you have to suspend some of those things. Otherwise, it really is a lot of noise that gets in the way of you really listening and dialing into the other person.
We get into that in a proactive section a little bit as well.
Yeah,
so we'll touch on that a little bit more. So number 3, and this one's really interesting. I don't know if you have this still pulled it up. Good. So know what Godwin's law is and don't invoke it. And so I put in here, Godwin's law is a term made up by Mike Godwin to point out that people all too often make analogies to Hitler or Nazism as a stand-in for everything bad or evil. It's one thing if you know quite a bit about this topic and really want to use it to draw a comparison, but in most cases it shows laziness and isn't really necessary. There are plenty of other analogies or comparisons that you could use to make your argument. Use one of them. And I mean, I bring up, like, even if you really are looking for that, evil person in history, I mean, there's a lot, there's quite a few. And you could, if you really are looking for the argument of history repeats itself and you're looking for those tangible pieces in history to make comparisons to. There are a lot of events that have happened in world history that you could draw on some things, but I think in so many cases, somebody's just bringing up Nazis or Hitler to be like that trump card, trying to be like just throwing down the gauntlet.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a bad face buttoner. It kind of works like, oh, you know why we shouldn't do this? 'Cause Nazis. Boom, mic drop. Exactly. Take a look at that. Read them in Wheat Boys.
Exactly.
Right. But it's very hyperbolic. It's very extreme. And it's probably something that you should avoid.
Yeah.
I mean, it's used as a carte blanche, essentially. It's the same idea. And actually, like, whenever I pulled this up here, the adage itself, kind of as a quotation here, is that as an online discussion grows longer, the probability of comparison involving Nazis or Hitler approaches 1, which is essentially that somehow a comparison is going to be made to either of those two things.
Yeah, given enough time.
Yeah. And essentially, like to your point, like the whole like throwing it down and being like mic drop, like that is kind of what is alluded to here, is that Someone will compare something or someone to Adolf Hitler or his deeds, and the point at which effectively the discussion or thread often ends. And it really is kind of, I mean, it is used in that I think that it often is used in that way specifically to end a conversation, I think. And that, I think, is the problem, which is why we're talking about it here.
Also interesting on the topic for today about the black or white fallacy. Also interesting anytime someone tries to color something as 100% one direction. Now, I know, like, obviously that's why people bring it up, is because they're trying to say, like, oh, this event or this person was so 100% bad. It's just the absolute end all be all end to my argument. But I think that if somebody we're really discussing some of those historical events or nuance, trying to color something to be absolutely bad or absolutely good, I think is already a sign that maybe you're not thinking about something 100%. I think it's really, I mean, just the best to avoid invoking that sort of law, if you will, in the first place.
Unless you really know your history.
Exactly. Unless you really know something about it, good or bad, it's just probably best to avoid it and, kind of move to something else, because, look, there are a lot of people that talk about the, benefits of socialism or even communism, and a lot of people bring up Joseph Stalin or Lenin as characters in history that caused a lot of deaths and starvation, and a lot of people will balance that out. So it's like we can have that discussion and we can talk about, hey, maybe there's good things, bad things, but in this particular case with World War II, it never really seems to go very well. It just gets things off the rails.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, and I think that it's important to know that this Godwin's law kind of item is really kind of a point in time. I mean, this is the real point is that you're trying to not just draw an immediate comparison to something as a means to stop the conversation.
Exactly. And we brought up earlier too, even Mike Godwin himself said, look, if you can show real knowledge about this subject and you can speak to it intelligently, then sure, go ahead. But, chances are maybe not so much. And I think one of you guys kind of mentioned that this even kind of fell into a hyperbole type of a deal. So if you want to read number 4.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the item that I'm referring to here is avoiding hyperbole. Hyperbole or superlatives, really. Essentially, you're using extremes to try to make your point, using always or never, or describing something in such an extreme that you lose credibility, or possibly even you're trying to discredit somebody else. So saying, like, you always put yourself first in every time that you're talking to me about this thing.
Exactly.
Or you never think about what it is that actually happens to the animals whenever you leave the house or something. Like you're essentially equivocating someone's actions.
Yeah, as seen in marital relationship and arguments across the world.
That's right.
The world.
Yeah.
But the other part of that too is we say in terms of avoiding hyperbole. I know I've mentioned it before. Jonathan Haidt's kind of thing with catastrophizing and sort of painting things in extremes. This kind of goes along with what we were saying with the Godwin's law. Trying to take some person and say, well, you're just like this evil person. It's like, are they really? Like, let's think about this claim for a second. And if we're going to say that somebody is like this other figure that we're comparing to, let's just talk about the finer points of that and saying, like, okay, well, your actions seem reminiscent of this person doing this, or let's focus a little bit more on the nuance and really try to focus on the actual claim, and just instead of just saying, like, this is the worst person in history and your argument is the worst idea that I've ever heard, like, okay, is it really? Like,
well, I think that really the laziness portion is kind of important, because I think that any time that you start to make those comparisons, you're really, instead of trying to make an actual, or like articulating a point about what it is that you're comparing, like this action versus this action, you're essentially just saying, well, it's like this, and then just kind of walking away from it, and hoping that by using a very well-known example that you can just kind of throw your hands up in the air and walk away from the conversation in a way.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think a lot of times it's evidence that someone is using emotional reasoning for something and taking it to a much bigger extreme. And I think that has a potential to lose credibility with whoever that you're speaking to. And I think that really gets to our next point. So the next point here is, if you choose to respond with a personal anecdote, be clear that you are just relaying your personal experience, and you shouldn't use that as a test for reality.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think the whole point of that was that we talked about how a personal anecdote could be a data point. If you have enough anecdotes and you put them together, that can become data.
Yeah.
But if you're just trying to say, well, this happened to me, and therefore I assume that this is the way it is for everybody else, that's not really a great place to start. I mean, the anecdote is a fallacy on its own, because if you're trying to use a personal anecdote as a sort of data point or a test for reality, as we say, it's not really valid, in terms of trying to prove a point or trying to take that as making it a case for a larger construct. I think it's really interesting in terms of conveying your personal experience to somebody if they're interested in your personal experience or what happened to you. But I think what we're trying to say here is just realize that it is a personal experience, and don't try to make it something larger than it is.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think sometimes even people will dismiss statistics or even good evidence by saying, well, it hasn't happened to me.
Yeah.
It's like,
that happens all the time.
Wow, okay, well then it must be total bogus then.
It's, personal incredulity.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so you guys feel comfortable with that? We want to go on to the next section here. So our next section being proactively engage and conversation framing. So let's just go ahead and do this. All right. So kind of setting this up, we mentioned the first part of this in terms of the last section. The rule number 1 in terms of proactively engaging is avoid logical fallacies overall. We've kind of brought up a couple of them here, and we've mentioned quite a few, but I think this really needs to stand apart and just sort of be reiterated, and say that when you are framing a conversation, when you're approaching it, engaging in active thinking to focus on making strong claims, avoid using those fallacies as much as possible. And we kind of note here, sometimes fallacies happen naturally, and using a fallacy does not necessarily invalidate your argument, which is the definition of the fallacy. But you should know what fallacies are, avoid them, and be able to recognize them when used by others.
Yeah, I think in this case, we're really just trying to identify the pitfalls or evidence that there could be some cognitive distortion somewhere in the discourse. So I think by defining these fallacies or biases, they're potential litmus tests tests for how sound your thinking is, or how well it could hold weight.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of times where, I will certainly be talking with somebody else, and, a straw man is another one that comes up. I don't think it's important enough to sort of, have it as its own sort of bullet point, but this is another one that we see a lot, where you basically, you look at somebody else's argument, sort of take it and morph it into something that is not the argument that they're making, so that you make it easier to defeat.
Yeah, definitely.
I think that kind of dovetails into number 2 as well. We kind of mentioned that.
Well, I mean, before you jump into number 2, I mean, just to define kind of what a straw man would be, it really is kind of an intentional misrepresentation or proposition that is set up because it's easier to defeat than an opponent's real argument.
Exactly.
And I think it really does dovetail very well into the active listening, because instead of interrupting somebody here, you're focusing on letting them finish. You're perhaps maybe raising your hand to let the other person know that you have a thought. And you really kind of want to think about, like, maybe trying to summarize or paraphrase a person's statements or positions as an exercise to see how well you were actually listening to check for accuracy.
Right.
Because you don't want to get into the kind of that logical laziness that comes with a straw man argument, where maybe you're sitting there trying to talk to somebody, and instead you're taking a person's statements and then throwing them into something that really has nothing to do with what they actually are saying.
Yes.
And then if you start going after this other thing that you essentially have created, you are no longer talking to that person. You're now talking to a completely different entity in a way. Like you're attacking something, or perhaps even discussing an item that has nothing to do with their actual position.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard certain professors say that unless you fully understand another person's position, you don't fully understand your own. So unless you're able to articulate the other person's position in a way that they would agree with and say, yes, that is the claim that I'm making, and you got that accurate, it's going to be difficult to continue and have that conversation go well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think if you're actively listening and you're really trying to understand somebody else's position to what you were just saying, is that, it can really, help you to define your own position a little bit more. Which I think also kind of leads us into the third point we have here, is that you don't look at it as a conversation, as a debate. So if you look at a discussion as an opportunity to learn and ask questions, as opposed to, quote, making a point or making the other person wrong, you build trust and conversations go smoother. This is not a professional debate in front of a live audience.
Right.
I think a lot of people, this is really, we list it here third, but I talk about this quite a bit when I talk about going into conversations. It's like, what is your goal of the conversation? Are you really trying to just make that person wrong? Are you trying to impress your other friends by just like, hey man, watch this sick burn? Like you said, it's like a mic drop. Yeah, exactly.
Oh yeah, that's like Nazis.
Exactly.
I'm out.
Yeah. So I mean, I think especially when if it's just a one-on-one conversation, I think it's a little bit easier to fall down this sort of derailing. I think that you can approach it maybe a little bit better, especially if it's somebody like a friend that you've built some trust with already.
Right, yeah.
You can have some conversations where maybe you really don't agree, or talk about some difficult things, and not be trying to sort of be antagonistic. Not, because a straw man sometimes can be used for malice, and sometimes you just do it accidentally because you weren't listening well enough. But I think lots of times, when you have a group setting, is really where I see, I'm gonna, like watch everybody else. I'm gonna just attack this person and show them how wrong they are. And it has this thing where we see too a lot of times the sort of mob effect, where it's like, I know my friends kind of agree with me, so I'm just gonna attack this person just because I can.
Yeah, like a certain kind of point scoring. And I think Jonathan Haidt in Coddling of the Coddling? That's right. He talks about in the kind of cancel culture, how there's this kind of point scoring mentality. Like, I'm going to go get this person and I'm going to look better with my tribe because I made them look bad. And what we see from the research, and I think this merits its own episode in the future perhaps, there's a kind of backfire effect with that method. Well, I think what we're seeing now, because a lot of times people that are more scientifically minded or whatever, they think, well, if I just show people the facts, that will do it, and that's all I need to do. But interestingly enough, peppering people with facts and saying, well, here's what the real situation is, a lot of times that really backfires, and they end up doubling down. And then especially if you throw in some ridicule in there and you shame people for having a belief that you don't agree with, that makes them even more entrenched in their belief, and it's very counter to what your goal might be, which is to have a conversation of mutual benefit. So, it's definitely worth something to avoid. And I think you should always go into a conversation saying, you know what, I could be wrong. There's something that this person might know that I don't know. And I'm going to ask questions not just for the other person, but for me.
So you saying that reminded me of this other phrase that I've heard of before, and this is a German word that I was exposed to a little while ago, but it's Schadenfreude. And if you want to, Ryan, just read there, like maybe the first definition or two.
Sure, yeah, and it is a pleasure derived from the misfortune of others, or malicious enjoyment derived from observing someone else's misfortune, and again, delight in another person's misfortune.
I don't think reality television or Twitter would survive without this.
Exactly.
That's
And
right.
so when I was first exposed to this, they even described it as like, it's sort of like the jackass effect, right?
sure.
It was like, oh man, I can't believe that guy just jumped off that thing and just, oh man, but it's like, people are watching this, it's like, and they're
Right.
For
deriving
sure.
effect. And it, even the whole, like we talk about like, oh, it's such a sick burn. It's like, there's something that's like, people get this like sick, twisted pleasure out of like seeing like
it's-
almost
Yeah.
pain or misfortune.
I actually kind of like this other Wikipedia thing down here as well, because it says it's a complex emotion where rather than feeling sympathy, one takes pleasure from watching someone's misfortune. And it says this emotion is displayed more in children than adults. And I mean, you probably see that a lot whenever you look at kids and they're playing around and somebody falls and they're laughing at their face,
or
like,
childish adults on the internet.
that too. It's a lot easier to be
Accurate.
childish.
Totally accurate.
Anonymity makes us childs all along.
Yeah.
But however, adults are also experienced at Schadenfreude, although generally they conceal it. And I think it is kind of one of those things where most of the time you wouldn't. I mean, in a public setting, you probably wouldn't necessarily want to show that you actually enjoyed somebody getting hurt or possibly even being.
Some of that is going off the rails a bit, though.
Yeah. I
I
would
think it's
agree,
become much more acceptable to just openly flaunt your Schadenfreude.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing is I would like to assume or think that there are some social norms where we have tried to not accept that and say like, hey, we it's not polite. And that's rude, and there's a certain sort of polite society that we could talk about, like, we shouldn't do that. And certainly there's a lot of talk for, sort of trying to maybe enforce even empathy or kindness, and at the same time, almost implicitly approving of non-empathy or kindness at the same time.
I think it's also in some ways a misappropriation of satire, because satire, I think when it's done well, it maybe ridicules or attacks questionable or bad ideas without necessarily attacking the essence of the person or enjoying the creation of another person's misery.
So I think we'll kind of get into this last section here. We call this troubleshooting. We kind of made the statement here, if you follow these guidelines, you should be able to converse with most people in a way that is not antagonistic and be able to walk away feeling that it was a mutually beneficial exchange. However, if you sense that things are going sort of off the rails, keep in mind that you can always pause, reset, or take a break from your conversation. And that was kind of my point, is like, hey, if you feel like things are heated or really getting so where you feel like you're getting angry or upset and not really able to sort of meet in the middle, or you're talking past each other, my kind of thinking is that you're probably not following these rules, but sometimes, and not rules, but guidelines.
Sure.
They're guidelines, and we certainly want to try to keep things like this in mind. These are just our ideas. I'm sure other people have a lot of their own ideas about how to promote effective conversation. I think that if you look to follow some of these guidelines and try to keep things in mind, like I've pointed out, I've had a lot of great conversations keeping these kinds of things in check and trying to be cognizant as I'm talking with people, and I've found that really keeps things civil, if you will. So I think that there's a lot of times, though, that for whatever reason, maybe somebody makes a misstep or things do start to get heated. I mean, it does happen a lot to the best of us, and I think this is a nice escape clause, if you will, that says like, hey, if these things do happen, kind of check it.
Well, I think that one of the biggest ones I think is the avoiding the logical fallacies in that proactive engagement. Like, you can be talking there, you could be you could be watching all of your reactions very well, and you could be very proactive. But the proactive element is kind of on you. And if the person there that you're listening to, talking to, and you start to notice that maybe they're starting to really throw in a lot more fallacies, maybe they've started to build up a straw man, and they're really starting to exaggerate a position that's not even yours. That really can be a good point to where you're like, okay, let's take a pause for a second, because I don't think that you're hearing what I'm saying. Or maybe I'm just not conveying myself very well. I just want to take a quick break because I feel like as if we might need to touch on this again later. And that's fine. Just giving yourself that opportunity and trying to make sure that you articulate it to the other person as well.
I think that's a great point, because you can only control what you control and your own reactions. And I think that part of this sort of, list that we've come up with here, maybe it's an assumption on my part too, that if you go into a conversation that the other person is sort of signed off on these same things. So, I mean, I think a lot of people probably don't say, hey, here's my list of guidelines that I'd like you to follow in the context of this conversation.
Here's my cheat sheet.
Although, I mean, I think that I might start doing that.
Just laminate this for
I
you.
will. I'll start printing off a couple copies. Like, hey, if you could go ahead and just sign this document, please, before we start talking.
Initial here and sign here. Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. And here's your triplicate copy. Pink is yours, yellow is mine.
Exactly. Perfect.
But yeah, I mean, I think that, there is an assumption that we could start to agree on some of these things. But I think that's why I wanted to start throwing some of this stuff out here, is because I would really love it if people could agree on some of these things. If we said, hey, here's some ground sort of guidelines. See, I'm just doing it again. I just want to say ground rules, but ground guidelines.
Ground guidelines. These guidelines were actually planted in the soil and brought all the way up from the ground up into rules.
And now we are able to harvest the fruit. Yeah, but I mean, like if we were able to agree with some of these things a little bit more before we started the conversation, I think that would try to keep some of these things more in check. But I also acknowledge it's just not realistic. And if you start a conversation with somebody, maybe you don't know them very well, you're not just going to say like, hey, here's all of my ideas about how to talk better.
Right. Yeah, I think it's important to remember that no matter how much you try to follow good practices and guidelines for conversation, especially with people that are close to you in your life, like a spouse or a family member or something, things will eventually go off the rails to some extent.
Heated, I mean,
we're just human. It's going to happen. So I think, to Ryan's point, a couple of things you want to look for is like when that good faith is leaving the room and you're not seeing the other person as on your side and you're starting to see them as an adversary. And you can start to notice that when you're interrupting, when the logical fallacies go out there and the ad hominem attacks. So I think you really need to be able to take real-time temperature of the conversation and see when things are getting out of a tolerance level, and a comfort level where it stops being a mutually beneficial exchange for people, and take that real-time diagnostic and say, okay, either we need to redirect the conversation or take a 5-minute pause, depending on the context, and just really retool here because things need to get back on track.
Well, now that you bring it up, I think we actually need to take a little bit of a break or a pause from this conversation.
You always say that.
I knew you were going to go there.
I never get a chance to say what I want to say.
You're such a pauser.
Okay, all right. Did you have something else to add?
Well, I was going to say that that you can kind of start to just keep in mind or key in those kind of things that happen. Like you might hear like the reactive items, like somebody saying, you always say that to me, or like you never listen to me whenever I'm trying to talk to you about something. And sometimes those can be kind of those little red flags. It can be something that can, as you start to listen more, like maybe you can course correct in the middle of a conversation. Say, well, I don't always say that. I do. I have in the past kind of said these things before. Like, I mean, I was trying to do this, or, you're saying that I never do that, but I like just. And if you try, you can sometimes prevent things from happening. Like sometimes you do kind of get off track and you can come back.
Yeah.
I think that's also a place for a good question.
Yeah.
Because like if you say that, it might be interpreted as defensiveness. It could be.
True.
So if you ask a question and allow for a pregnant pause, that's really important. So, okay, well, how did you come up with that I always do that? What's what's your basis for saying that? And just listen.
Well, and you're giving them the opportunity to think about what it is that they actually said too.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
possibly even allowing yourself, like you can even ask yourself that question. You may have actually been the person that just said, you always do this to me.
Yeah.
Or you like,
And
I
invites
feel
that
like,
response.
and you just
Exactly.
sit, maybe you should sit there and go, wait, I just said always.
Yeah.
Did
Yeah.
I really mean that?
The thing about always and never, and
Yeah.
I say this a lot too, is, when you make a big claim, you make it easier for me to poke holes in it.
Exactly.
So if you say always or never, okay, so what you're saying is I only have to find one time where that wasn't the case, and that invalidates your claim.
Right.
Yeah.
You make it too easy, really. And so if we're actually going to sort of try to find these places where we can sort of agree on what our sort of mutual reality is, then if I just have to come up with one thing that invalidates your claim, then you're really just making my job easier.
Right.
So let's try
And now
to.
you're starting to look at it as the conversation is a debate.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. You're seeing
Exactly.
There it goes right back
Exactly,
around.
and it comes right back around. So we can sort of, and I like what Nathan said is like, hey, and trying to ask a question and sort of keeping it from going into that place in the first place. And if we can also then just avoid always and never and say, like, well, I think that what usually happens, and that, still allows for a really, good conversation when still conveying that I think that most of the time things are this way, because then that makes it a lot harder to sort of say, well, no, I disagree, or that's totally not right. You know?
It's interesting, and I think we are kind of winding things down, but I think a lot of these things take a lot of courage and vulnerability to put into practice, because it's so much easier to come into conversations with that armor up and say, oh, this is why I'm right, and I'm going to go to the mattresses with this person. But it takes a lot of courage to employ some of these things.
Wait, go to the mattresses or go to the mat?
Oh,
I mean, if you're going to the
Depends upon
mattresses,
the relationship.
exactly.
Sometimes you might be going to the mattresses after this conversation.
yeah. Well, so going to the mattresses is actually a Godfather term.
Oh,
So that would be like, not
The
wrestling.
horse head kind of thing?
Exactly. That's right. Yeah. So sorry. Well, that's another obscure idiom that we have to watch for. So, case in point, I put out an idiom there that a lot of people might not know, and so it's like, all right.
I always just knew it was like going to the mat, like the wrestling mat.
Yeah.
That was what I was thinking too.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Like you're
right
duking
on.
it out.
Right. All right. Well.
Yeah.
It's a
All
great
right.
conversation.
Exactly. I think we'll go ahead and wrap things up there. This has been sort of our list of some of the guidelines to follow. We're really looking forward to sharing that with everybody, and I think there's some good things there. I would really like to see more people kind of throw some ideas like this out and kind of add to this. But I think, we'll say good night at that, and thank you guys so much.
Yeah,
All right.
you.
Thank you.
All right. Cheers.
Bye.